한국 청중을 만나는 건 처음인 것 같은데 간단히 인사를 좀 해주시겠습니까?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank NEWS1 and the Future Forum, and in particular Dr. Yoon-Sung Park for inviting me. I hope you've had a great session, and I look forward to contributing some thoughts in the next few minutes.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, 강연을 시작해 주시겠습니다.
Sure, thank you. So I will spend this session speaking very briefly about the pandemic, its effect on the world and globalization and the world order, and the opportunities that come out of that for countries, companies and investors as well. We're an investment firm, so we look at macro, we also look at how the impact of macro changes affect the investment landscape. So we will go from very high level down to a very detailed level in examining the impact. So firstly, the pandemic reveals some very harsh and difficult truths about the world. Before the pandemic, if anyone asked us, we would have all said that it is clear that America and the Western world perhaps had some of the best systems of government, of healthcare, and the ability to cope with the crisis. In this pandemic, though, what we've seen is the world is turned upside down. So in terms of the responsibility to save lives and look after the economy, the greatest suffering has been in the US, and then number two in the European countries, and the rest of the world has done not as badly as both those two regions. None of us would have expected that, I think, before we began, but it is unusual, and it has a very important changing impact on the world, I think, as we look ahead. If we look at it somewhat differently, and we look at the unfortunate and very sad and tragic death count per million in the world, and also the impact on the economies, then in the bottom left of this chart, what you will see is that America and some of the European countries have suffered the most. They're the most deeply impacted in the world. In the top left-hand corner, you will see those that have been damaged as economies, that have managed to save lives in their countries. And then on the top right, you will see some examples of countries that have been very resilient. And despite the fact that some of them are not the richest countries in the world, their efforts to save lives have been successful to date. But I would warn that the pandemic is not over, of course, and so we will learn more maybe in a year's time. But at this stage, if the test that was applied to the world and each country and each leader in the world was to save lives and save their economies, then the world has truly turned upside down. And tragic as that is, I think the world is adjusting to this new reality that we're all facing. It is a multi-level shock, of course, that the world has experienced. And as we look at what it means for the global scenario, there are a number of shocks to focus on. The first is perhaps the public health shock. There are now more than 500,000 deaths in the world. And if we count the associated deaths, the count is 50 to 60% higher. So we are edging towards nearly 1 million deaths from the pandemic so far. And that is despite governments taking actions to lock down in various degrees across the world. There is a supply shock, of course, to industrial production, which has started to halt, and very few sectors are alive and well today. There is a demand shock where the consumer has gone into a recession, and of course is buying, but not able to buy in the same levels that we saw in the early part of the year. There is a trade shock, of course, a social shock in the reduction of working hours that people are able to put in, a market shock with the volatility in capital markets being quite dramatic since the beginning of the year, a wealth shock. We've seen something like nearly 5% to 10% of wealth written off in the world across the global economy. And a human shock where there is, of course, a lot of mental health issues and stress. If this was by any measure an attack on the system itself of the world, and this were a country launching this attack on the world, or a foreign power, or on the whole global system, then each of us would look at this and say we've been very successful in undermining the international unity of the world and the performance of the world along so many different metrics. This is a very detailed chart, and I will ask you not to focus on, but only to focus perhaps on the areas that are marked in red. And what we have done in a very detailed study is look at the resilience of countries, and we picked a sample of countries from the West, but also China and India. And we benchmarked them across four sectors, or four different categories. The first is the population and demographic risk, because what we find is in populations that are very dense, and where the demographic population is skewed toward age, of course the pandemic has a much stricter and harsher fatal impact. And then we, number two, looked at the healthcare and social protection that a country offers its people to see if they can protect them from harm. The third impact is on economic resilience against macro shocks. And the fourth is policy capacity for economic stimulus. These are four important categories to see if a country is resilient and strong in the face of this horrible attack on, of course, the livelihoods and the lives of people around the world. And the results are quite shocking. As you see in pink first, as you step back, or red, there are too many red areas. So it tells you that there are more red areas, more areas of risk and lack of resilience, and therefore vulnerability in the world than one would hope for. The world is not resilient. That would be the first conclusion. The second is if you look at each of the countries and you look across, you will find that many countries are less resilient than we would have hoped. And America is one of those countries that is less resilient. The UK is less resilient, but many European countries are less resilient. Amongst the most resilient is Germany, and also China is quite resilient too. We would expect poorer countries that are developing, like India, to be less resilient. But the surprise is how many European, and particularly America itself, is vulnerable to such a shock. It tells us that we were not prepared, and we might have believed that we were prepared. But under a crisis, an extreme crisis of this time, the world has much to do to actually improve its infrastructure, its social systems, its healthcare facilities, and so on, to actually be capable of handling much worse shocks that are bound to come in the years ahead. So to sum that up and bring it together, the world is ill-prepared for a pandemic. And if there are more pandemics, which there will be, from what we understand from people who study this well, that we are not prepared and probably will suffer much more unless these items are addressed by governments and the international community and international institutions. Secondly, the US was much exposed from its system not being ready for such a shock. And part of that is the political system, of course, but it's also the economic and social system of the country. The US markets have done enormously well, but the mainstream economy has taken a sharp shock, and also the political system has not managed to cope as well with such a shock. Thirdly, the US economic stability, which is so important to the world, to globalization, to trade, to the financial system, rests on its ability now to keep increasing liquidity in the money supply. Luckily, the US faces a situation which many advanced countries do, which is interest rates are low, inflation is low, and so it does have the ability to print money. And it would have to continue to heroically print money to avoid a horrible crisis for itself and the knock-on impact for the rest of the world. In Europe, the UK, and now less so Italy, have similar exposures. The UK has suffered much more. India, of course, as a developing country, has taken very radical steps. And in common with many of the Asian economies, they took the virus very seriously, and they secured their borders, they began testing. I think India has done approximately 7 million tests to see if they can track the virus and its impact. But it had to take these radical steps. As it opens up, of course, it is also exposed. In Europe and as we benchmark across the world, you do find that Germany has a very strong resilience profile. It has a good, strong approach to managing this pandemic, but also has very good healthcare, social systems, a strong economy, and the ability to be resilient in the face of this change. And it also took very early measures to take the virus very seriously. China overall is very resilient, very strong. And although this virus would have originated in China and spread to the rest of the world, China was able to contain it early, and now we've seen, of course, a second wave impact. But it is resilient comparative to many other countries. The global support for the world has been somewhat inadequate in terms of the world working together. If we compare how the world and the global system has handled this relative to, say, the Cold War before this, or the First World War, or the Second World War, this has not been a coordinated effort where there has been leadership from leading countries to the rest of the world, and international institutions and world leaders have worked together in a coordinated fashion as if it was a world war. That's partly because many countries and their leaders believed that this was not serious, or they believed it could not really penetrate their economies and their people and social systems so effectively. But we have not really had the global coordination, and I think this will be something much to think about after this pandemic is over, if not throughout the year and next year too maybe. Global institutions have a critical task and have been, of course, trying to make that impact and work well to try and spread the message and spread the lessons. But again, there is a need to look at that too. And then the capacity for leadership is not gone, and it's still required because most countries have only experienced the first wave and have not survived the first wave fully yet, and the second wave has already begun. If we examine the impact and how it spreads, we see, of course, that it has a number of epicenters. So the first epicenter was China, the second was Europe, the third is the US, the fourth has been in Latin America, particularly Brazil, and then it has come back to Asia, and India perhaps is now in the next target and is now trying to figure out how to cope with that. If this were a war, we would look at this and we would see a very effective enemy that was crossing borders, infiltrating countries and making a dramatic impact and success in disabling countries. Unfortunately, the principles of war, which is something if we take from the US military, for example, there are a series of principles that could be applied to counter this attack from the virus, and for all of us to work together all the way across each of the epicenters. And we have not actually done that this time. And I think as we step back and study this for many years, I think we will find that we have not performed as a world economy and as a global community to see the threat, take it seriously, and take all the measures that we would take in any war, regardless of whether it came from a person, a country, a group of any sort, or a virus of this time. I'm sure there will be many, many lessons. So the geopolitical considerations is macro for countries and also for companies and for investors. Firstly, the death counts in the histories last two superpowers, the US and the UK, exceed all others. And that is an interesting and shocking result that no one would have expected. Number two, America has not been able to lead the world. There are problems at home, which may be political, but also in terms of their own healthcare system and coping with this change in a federal versus state system has been not effective enough to show the global leadership that people expected. Number three, the national level regime changes are probably something to look out for. As a result of this, across many countries, people will be unhappy. We can see the protests already, and people will wish their country's leaders to change. So as we look ahead as communities and also as investors and companies, we should be looking at countries to see where the risk level has risen. And there is unfortunately, of course, a very strong anti-China sentiment, which is strengthened, and trust in some ways is broken. China has worked hard to convince the community of the world that they can be an ally and they can be enormously supportive of the global community. But across the world, not just in the US, where there is of course rivalry with China, but also in Europe and some of the leading economies there, in Australia, and recently in Asia too, there has been a lot of pushback and a somewhat breaking of trust. So rebuilding the trust in the community will be an enormous factor, I'm sure, going forward, and I think will be very difficult. The international rethink of the role of institutions, international institutions, and how they can play a much more impactful role in the future is also something, of course, that will be very important to take into account. The EU is reforming and will have to, of course, rethink its political and financial institutions so they can protect their countries far better, and they're already starting to think that through and grip that. And then Asia, of course, emerges much stronger. If we look ahead, Asia has shown that it is quite resilient. It takes threats very seriously. Its risk measurement and its leadership have been very strong. That includes, of course, in South Korea, but also in Taiwan, also in poorer countries like India. They're taking this very seriously. And you see the same thing, of course, in Japan, where these economies have taken the threat, tried to evaluate it, learn from each other. And interestingly, their benchmarks have not been the West, which has traditionally been the way, but they've been each other. And so Asia is set to emerge much stronger and much more confident, we believe, from this crisis. Countries will, though, of course, rethink trade, free trade, globalization, and although I expect that a new globalization will emerge in the short term, we see that self-reliance and the national assets you need to be reliant and self-reliant will, of course, rise to the top of the agenda of most politicians in their countries. So we should expect some reshoring of activities, of course, some strategic collaboration where people think they can share resources in a crisis. But the totally free flow that we have seen during the last part of last century, the 20th century, and the early part of this century is no doubt under question today. I will focus on China because the Chinese economy and the Chinese growth has been so important to the world, and China's role in the world in major international institutions and in major issues and tackling those issues in the world has risen to the top of the agenda. And as America sometimes seems to step back from things such as climate change and also from international institutions and their impact on the UN and the WHO, China seemed to be ready to exercise a much stronger position in these international bodies. With this crisis, though, things have changed a bit. From China's side, they have admitted the lack of initial transparency. They have searched for the common ground. They deny any conspiracies, of course. They didn't have some sort of counter-conspiracy attack on the US, but they seeked and looked for the higher ground. The international reaction, though, has not been positive. Very harsh words have been said about China and its lack of transparency. Some countries have spoken about exiting China, and also in their own countries placing restrictions on China. There have been a warning of consequences, even of reparations, which normally happens after a conflict, punishing China in some ways and allies of China, and starting to see China as a strategic enemy or a rival. And so this is again an enormous change in the world. And although the conflict was there between the US and China, it seems to have spread now. And so the international community will have to think about the consequences of that, the global trade and globalization, and the whole supply chain of the world is impacted as a result. And the prospects for China, of course, have changed as a result. And this is an enormous strategic issue, but not just China, but the rest of the world too, to figure out the way forward and see if there are peaceful ways to, of course, bring this together. But again, as I said earlier, it may not be so simple and so easy to actually manage this and make this happen in a way that is effective for the world. And so we should expect some risk factors to arise in the global economy as a result. With it, of course, will come opportunities for many countries across South Asia and across the rest of the world. But certainly the risk level has gone up. So the next question arises, can the world solve the biggest issues And can they have unity? And here, unfortunately, there is a psychological difference between the world. And so, if you think of the world in terms of people who believe that we have enough, or we don't have enough in the world, in terms of natural resources, and if you think on the other dimension of people who believe that we should share or that we should compete, then you find that countries fall into four simple blocks. The first is countries who believe that there is enough if we only work together. So if we share and we collaborate, then there will be enough for all of us. The EU is a good example of that. Generally, they have the view that collaboration and rules of engagement and working together will result in enough for all of us. At the other extreme, if you believe that there is not enough, and of course the world is rising from just over 6 billion people at the beginning of this century, by 2050 we expect nearly 10 billion people. So, of course, many countries believe there will not be enough natural resources to go around. Then, in that case, they might take the view that rather than collaborate to solve those problems of sharing, they would rather compete and hold the resources. In the last 5 years, in that category of thinking that we should compete and we should take the resources for our own countries, both China and America will fall into that category. Now, America plays both roles. Sometimes, of course, America has been the advocate of enormous sharing, and it has also, because its companies are so strong and good at this, they also acquire many resources first. So we have a split in the world now that is psychological. So it's uncertain whether globalization, free trade, the spread of information across the world, the spread of products can continue smoothly, and whether countries can also tackle some of the biggest issues, whether those are climate change, or whether those are about conflicts or border issues. It is uncertain because the world view is so different. And this again is an important topic for reconciliation across the world, and for forming a common worldview, of course. But that, I think, will be again very tough, because we're in such different places. And we live in times which I think, in retrospect, are probably revolutionary times. Not revolution in the 20th century sense, where when we had revolutions, people of course had wars and they killed each other in very large numbers, and tens of millions of people died. It doesn't feel like we're in that scenario, but we're in a scenario where, because of social media, spread of information across the internet, and the empowerment that people feel, they feel much more free to protest. And so whereas protests began in the early part of the 21st century in the Middle East, in the Arab Spring, and people expected that to go to other poorer countries where there were autocracies. Instead it spread to the UK and Europe, and they had a Brexit. And people felt unhappy about their situation, and they thought the answer was a Brexit. It also then spread to the US, where the surprise victory of President Trump in the election actually led to another shake-up of the world. And then it came around, and it came to the east, and we've seen it in Hong Kong with a series of protests. But surrounding these major events, there are many, many protests, whether those are the Black Lives Movement protests, or the Extinction Rebellion protests, or the Yellow Vests in Paris. But the world is seeing social protest, unrest, and rioting as a normal way of people expressing their unhappiness with the world. And so it is an unusual time too, because regardless of how a country's leaders feel, people feel empowered to take to the streets and make sure they're heard. This has a profound impact not just on globalization, but also how the world works now for everything, including investments, including industries, including trade, and people in companies and countries react, therefore, to things that change in the world. Asia in this process is a rising power, and if you look at many dimensions, whether they're global GDP, or whether they are industrial production, military spend, consumption, building of infrastructure, Asia rises in 2010, where the numbers were about 30% of the world's share, to 2050 expected to be 50%. And in 2020, we see the share normally is between 40% or so of each of these items which are so important to the world economy. China's growth path has been very systematic. It took 50 years to get to $1 trillion. 7 years to get to 2 trillion, 5 years to get to 3 trillion. Surprisingly, India's path has been the same. It took 50 years to get to $1 trillion, 7 years to get to 2 trillion, 5 years, this has been the year where it would have crossed 3 trillion, except for the pandemic a little bit. So surprisingly, both, despite their such different economic and political models, have risen in the same way. So looking ahead, the rules of engagement for the world are probably set by 4 power blocks, and the peoples, of course, of the whole world. So the US is one of the power blocks, Europe, the EU, China, and India. And so interestingly, these 4 together probably form the power blocks that affect the world. Looking ahead, of course, at economies and companies and investment themes, there are 3 big investment themes to highlight. The first is digital, the second is delivery, the third is diversification. And in each of these, digital, of course, is digital tracking, connectivity, behavioral analytics, and so on. But delivery, physical delivery, of course, has been proven in this pandemic to be enormously important. But also digital education, digital finance, healthcare, and so on. And in terms of diversification, supply chains are becoming diversified, and geographies will have to be diversified. And the big theme underlying all of these will include mass population inclusion. And people will want to be included in the system, and digital provides that platform. And so, as I wrap up, I would say countries, companies, and investors that can see the pandemic as an oracle, as something that looks into the future, will focus on themes of this type: the regeneration of the environment, the global digital participation, remote working, digital education and payments, a resilient healthcare and social system, much more responsible capitalism that seeks to make money but also make an impact, the rethinking of almost urban centers, and of course a much faster pharmaceutical process that looks at infectious diseases and healthcare issues, and then mass capital for mass problems, how to mobilize money across the world to change quite dramatically. I will stop there and pause for any questions, of course, and thank you very much for listening to me.
네, 감사합니다. 정정을 대신하여 질문을 하나 드리겠습니다. 투자사를 좀 이끌고 계신데 어느 지역, 어떤 사람을 주목하고 계십니까?
Sure. So we see 3 industries that are part of our mandate. The first is technology, the second is healthcare, and the third is services, particularly financial services. So we invest in highly innovative businesses with very low cost structures, but a global footprint where they are able to participate in the global economy. One of the lowest cost structures in the world we find is India. India's cost structure is about 1/7, about 15% of China's. And so as a result, we find that a lot of the costs of the companies we're investing in are in India or other parts of Asia, but the revenues are generated across the world for all 3 of these sectors. And there are so many innovative companies now in each of these 3 sectors for us to look at.
Thank you very much. 감사합니다. 좋은 강연 감사합니다. 다시 한번 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well done. Well done,
My
Ketan.
pleasure.